Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and this is the Good Life Podcast. Hello, welcome to the Good Life Podcast. I'm Matt Carpenter, and I am glad today to be joined by John Ehrett. John is a writer. He is an attorney in Washington, D.C. He's written for several online and print journals, including the Claremont Review of Books, American Affairs, the American Reformer, and he's written a lot about a topic that is rising, especially in those in their 20s and 30s among American Christian males and just American males in general. So, John, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. Appreciate your having me.
So you've written a lot about the West and the loss of Christendom, of Christian culture, and the attempts to pull it back, to revive it, however, whatever is the best way of saying that. So let's just start, because we'll use some of these terms a good bit. How do you define the West, or how do you define Christendom when we talk about that?
That's a great question. I think I would define Christendom as the complex of societies that have really had a post-Constantinian imprint on them. And I would not say this is a negative thing necessarily. There are some people, I think Stanley Hauerwas among them, who would say that that was Christianity's original sin in some sense. But if we just look at it from a historical standpoint, we see much of North America, much of Europe, even some other civilizations in the world, such as parts of North Africa, Latin America, South America. All of these have the mark of Christian civilization, and specifically a relationship in which Christianity, once it took over the Roman Empire under Constantine and his successors, really played an instrumental role in transforming those societies' approach to not just religion, but also their governance, their art, their sense of themselves, and their sense of history as a whole. And when we talk about the West, I think that's what most people are referring to, even though now that term is a lot more contested and people debate exactly what that means, especially as we understand the West relative to societies that don't have that Constantinian or Christendomic heritage.
I know Russell Kirk, in his book, The Roots of American Order, gave a picture of the West that includes beginning with the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Christians together. And now some people, and we'll talk more about this later on, some people emphasize one of those over others, but probably in Christian circles at least. We of course emphasize Christianity, and then growing up, a lot of evangelicals, the only thing that many evangelicals heard, at least that I'm speaking for myself largely, we heard about the Judeo-Christian heritage that was used in the I remember Pat Buchanan's presidential campaigns, and even Ronald Reagan, George Bush the first, and George W. Bush as well. So that it is a loaded term, but now we see that a lot of those, the institutions, the society, the culture, there's a dissolution, as in a breakup or a breakdown of the West. So what are the responses, or how have people responded in recent times to what looks like the crumbling of this great structure that is or was Christendom?
I think people have been debating exactly what to do about that crack up, so to speak, almost since the Reformation period. And in the early modern period, you start getting a reorganization of political institutions around the idea of the nation state, and around the possibility that relations between nation states could be mediated according to principles of natural reason accessible to them all. And so that would in effect mean that even entities not subject to the universal jurisdiction of the Catholic Church could relate to each other in a nonviolent way. And I think that's where you begin to see the emergence of what a lot of people both positively or negatively refer to as liberalism, or the idea that there can be neutral standards of rationality and justice to which both parties can appeal in a way that mitigates intraconfessional and interconfessional violence. And as that progresses and as the liberal project advances, you see a lot of optimism about human reason running down through the Enlightenment. And then that ultimately culminates in the big totalitarianisms of the 20th century. So on the right, you have Nazism. On the left, you have communism. And as a result, you have a lot of skepticism about the ability of human reason to lead to these positive results and to lead to a universal world order characterized by peace and not violence. And what's interesting is that when people talk about the Frankfurt School, it's oftentimes raised as a kind of conspiracy theory. But this was the original question the Frankfurt School was trying to deal with: is how did our project of human rationality bring us to communism on the left and Nazism and fascism on the right? And what does that mean about the world in which we live today? And so after that kind of post-war period, you see increasing attention to the possibility of a kind of liberalism that brackets out metaphysical and nationalistic questions altogether. People will refer to this as the post-war consensus, and Rusty Reno gives a good analysis of this issue in his book Return of the Strong Gods. But and more recently, I think, especially with the events of 2016 and afterwards, you're starting to see cracks in that foundation and the possibility that you really can't appeal to these universal standards in a way that satisfies people's pre-political yearnings in some sense, or their desire to be characterized by realities and groupings that aren't just, here I am part of a global economic order where I'm defined by my contribution to the national GDP. You see pre-modern identity configurations such as religion, such as culture, those become increasingly important in this period. And I think that that's plunged a lot of Christians across the West, as we've talked about it kind of the broad sense, into a time of reckoning as we figure out what does it look like if we increasingly can see that the political configuration that treats us all as economic units and that focuses on ever lowest common denominators of public morality, how far can you push this and still have a cohesive civilization capable of engaging in moral reasoning projects together? So you've got that from the Christian perspective and the kind of broadly conservative or right perspective. And on the left, you see increasing awareness that supposedly liberal sets of norms and values do in fact embed power relations of their own. They exclude some perspectives and elevate others. And I think that intuition is where you get a lot of wokeness, what was people would call wokeness, or the social justice left. It's this kind of criticism of the liberal consensus that we basically have agreed to since both the post-war period, but running before that to the attempts to tamp down confessional violence in the Middle Ages.
It's hard for people today to who are weary of all of the degradation of public morals, of the things that they loved and remembered as a child, certainly in the United States, but I'm sure even more in Europe. The Europeans have longer memories than we do, certainly. And when you have beautiful things, whether physical or metaphysical, in your culture, and you see them cracking and people point the blame to liberalism, we think, well, of course, we just gave way too much freedom. But it's hard for us to imagine 500 years ago that there was wars going on, not just over, I mean, yes, Protestant and Catholic, but there were wars going on over which version of Protestantism you were. So if you were Anglican or if you were Puritan, well, that's a cause for a fight because somebody's going to control the pocketbook. So, I mean, and somebody's going to control the national churches. So we don't, because we have no concept of that. It doesn't make sense to us that liberalism was actually an appealing idea because we're just going to set aside all these areas where we disagree, and we're going to agree to disagree. But as you said, now we put so many things in this bin of where we agree to disagree that it's actually it suppresses, it has suppressed our ability to to speak about much of anything except whatever the popular bromides are of the day.
Right. And I think as we see the fact we've learned in the last 50 to 100 years just how radically people can offer different interpretations of the baseline facts of reality. But as you mentioned, the idea that we can have universal standards that we can all appeal to, that comes out of a milieu in which cities and towns and entire countries are just completely devastated. Thousands of people killed over what we would now consider differences that could be hashed out within a pan-Protestant political project. We don't see this as driving violence on the scale that people once did. I think it's very easy to look back and be like, wow, those people unleashed this monster of liberalism that's undone our entire country. But we're also not the people who are bleeding and broken at the end of seeing our countries and our families killed in these horrific conflicts. And I think if we could transplant ourselves back into that milieu, we would have very different conclusions than I think the ones that I think a lot of people are willing to voice on Twitter. And paradoxically, the idea that we can have universal standards to which all people can reasonably appeal, that's a natural law argument. And that comes out of the ideas of Christianity and Judaism before that, the idea that there's one God who's imposed rational order upon the world in a way that people can find out. And so that intuition that drives early liberalism is a very Christian intuition. And where it becomes more difficult is the idea that you can approach that apart from a explicitly religious understanding of authority and tradition in determining how to interpret the objective data of reality. We cut ourselves off from the ability to acknowledge that our interpretations are always conditioned by our experiences and the institutions that form us. I think that's one of the biggest drivers of both the postmodern phenomenon and the critique of supposed universally accessible standards of rationality. But it's also driving the Christian post-liberal critique that this project has failed because it has failed to acknowledge that it requires both a religious grounding on the objective metaphysical level, but also at the epistemological level, how we know what is ultimately real. We do that through our institutions, such as our churches and through the Bible.
Right. So there are many responses Christians have offered to in recent times to the breakup of the West, to the falling away of the standards. On the Roman Catholic side, you have those who are called integralists, and then those that many of our listeners will be more familiar with on the Reformed side is theonomists. So, what is the correlation between those two views? I mean, on one hand, it's two vastly different wings of Christianity, but many of their goals seem similar.
That's a great question. I think the core intuition that drives both of those is the fact that there is no perspective that is presuppositionless, and that no matter what liberal arguments you can make for the alienation of you as a subject from your conditions and the circumstances of your environment, you always bear with you the marks of your upbringing, your culture, your conditioning, what you've been trained to see. You simply can never reach a view from nowhere. And that Immanuel Kant spent many, many hundreds of pages trying to establish just that. And I would say that once you get into the 20th century, thinkers like Martin Heidegger really blow that up and say that, your entire way in which you approach the world before you even reflect on it consciously has already been shaped by the circumstances in which you're born and in which you spend your life. And that's the intuition that I think is sound within both the theonomic and integralist perspectives, is that the way in which you approach the real is always going to be shaped by the kinds of institutions and the conditions in which you find yourself. So if your perception of reality is shaped by biblical language from the start, you're going to interpret reality very differently than if you're given, first of all, the concepts and the vocabulary of the secular child rearing academy as it is today. And I think that to the extent that both integralist and theonomic positions want to argue for that on an epistemological level, that's sound. Where I think they start to take a different turn is that they start to call into question the possibility of communication across these paradigms at all. And so the idea that there is a rationally ordered world, even if we do approach it through our interpretive traditions that God created, and that people of different backgrounds can in fact appreciate and meaningfully reason together about. And you start to see this kind of epistemological skepticism, especially in Van Til, but you also get it from certain integralist writers, and D.C. Schindler has argued for this, that basically, apart from a particular interpretive schema, you can in fact have no meaningful communication with anybody else. You cannot in fact talk about the idea that the world in fact reflects the creative imprint of the one God before all worlds. And you really don't have that kind of idea of natural law that emerges. So natural law kind of drops out of the picture at the same time that you're affirming the fact that all human reasoning does in fact rely on an interpretive foundation. So there's a fruitful tension there that I think exists between acknowledging that, there is a world outside ourselves that God created that we can rationally discuss with other people, including people from outside our own traditions, outside the Christian tradition even, but simultaneously acknowledging that God in his word has given us an interpretive schema for that really does transform how we approach that reality that's generally accessible to people.
The first thing that clued me into the similarities of the two projects was when I read in a book. It was the history of Triumph magazine. The kind of the original Roman Catholic integralist magazine published by Brent Bozell back in the 1970s. Was that they had R.J. Rushdoony write for them.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yes. So
wow.
Now, he was not a regular writer, but he did write for them. So just the fact that, first of all, he would consent to do so, this arch reformed thinker, I mean, it demonstrates that there are some similarities in the project that they're working towards. Now, of course, if one or the other had actually had their way, be looking at a different few steps in history. But it was still
a second 30 years war between them.
Yeah, perhaps. But so you have the Christian responses, but then there are other responses that are less Christian, leaning more in a pagan direction. Now, you have several articles, and I will post in our notes all of I'll post the articles that we refer to that you've written, because they will give a lot more space to what you have to say that I think would be helpful for people who are interested in diving further. But one element that's common in the non-Christian response to the breakup of the West is that of mythology, ancient mythology, whether Norse, some Greek, and you even referred to some of the movies that have come out that demonstrate this, like the Northman or Beowulf, a few years back. So to just talk about the revival of old mythology and how it plays into the response of some to our problems today.
Yeah, so the genealogy of liberalism that we previously talked about, where you have this argument from a lot of people that once we introduce principles of freedom and universal standards of rationality to which everybody can appeal, that sets the West on a downward trajectory. That is a fundamentally Christian argument, basically. That's a Catholic adjacent type argument. The much older type of argument, you got this from some paleo-conservatives throughout all of American history, but throughout a lot of countries that really are not part of the West at all. The argument runs that Christianity is itself the problem, and that the idea that Christianity introduces into world history the idea of a universal God above the gods of all the nations, to whom all have to ultimately pay allegiance, and relative to whom all human beings stand in essential metaphysical equality. That's something that the defenders of, I think, what you could call a neo-pagan revival or an atavist revival, that's something that they see as a fundamental problem, because human history, as we see in all these different mythologies around the world, human history before Christianity reflects a principle of hierarchy between individuals, reflects the idea that there are some people who are just naturally created superior to others, and as such have the right to rule. And the canonical statement of this would be in ancient Indian civilization, the Indian subcontinent, the laws of Manu, which have four different castes. We have the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Sudras, reflecting different social groupings in society. So you have the priests, you have the warriors, you have the merchants and shopkeepers, and the middle class, and you have the laborers. Whatever caste grouping that you're born into on the laws of Manu, that affects your destiny. And you can move up or down as you're reincarnated through different cycles of human existence. But that basically sets out the contours of your place in society. There is no essential metaphysical equality between human beings. Human beings, as such, are inherently unequal, and society has to reflect that fact. I think you can make a pretty compelling argument that that's the natural condition of pre-Christian human civilizations. And you see this in Norse culture, you see this in Greco-Roman culture. If you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you see these kinds of hierarchical groupings start to emerge. You see women and men treated very differently on the basis of their metaphysical roles and their metaphysical identities over and beyond any sort of common ground that might exist between them. And so across the world, you see a pattern of intrinsic hierarchies that can be divided by gender, that can be divided by social position, that can be divided by biological race in some form, shape, or kind. And I think as people look at the current landscape of political discourse, which really wants to obviate differences between men and women, which really wants to take very aggressive views of egalitarianism in many ways, there's an appeal to these kinds of old, very hierarchical views of civilization. And the argument runs that once Christianity came in and started talking about human equality before God, that in effect made us think a lie, made us think something that's not fundamentally correct about how human beings are. Nietzsche was making this critique back in the 1800s. And so, in other words, for people who take this position, what we need to do is to go back behind Christianity altogether, to get the entire Christian debris of liberalism and Christianity and all of this just completely out of the way and start talking about intrinsic human difference and intrinsic human hierarchy. And that's the way that any sort of meaningful conservative or right-wing political project has to go. And I think that that's something that we're starting to see, not just from the fringes, but we're starting to see it make its way into more popular spaces, or at least I think you can make an argument that it's coming in a baptized form as well. They're both baptized and unbaptized versions of this.
So you answered then why this is a draw for many. And that brings us to another term that you've written about that honestly, I'd heard it. I did not know what it meant until you defined it in your article. That is vitalism. So just define or describe vitalism for us, because we'll use the term over the rest of this discussion. So, and is it exactly what you just described, that return to hierarchy? Is it more? So just tell us about that word.
I think we could define this best by looking at what it's definitely not. And so if you think about a Christian monk or a hermit or somebody in the desert who decides to devote their entire life to God and goes off or sits on a pillar like the Stylites hermits in the desert monasticism tradition, somebody who lives like that, who lives a world of a life of renunciation and a life devoted to the transcendent, that is the opposite of the vitalist. The vitalist is everything that's not that. If Irenaeus said that the glory of God is a man fully alive, I think we can say that for the vitalist, to be fully alive is the glory of man. And so a human being who is physically strong or perfect, who's, if they're a man, who's virile, who begets children, who's sexually prolific, who is physically powerful and capable of imposing his will upon a world that resists him at every turn. So the idea of vitalism is that this is the best way to live in a world because there's really no eternity that would justify the possibility of self-denial. So don't deny yourself, but at the same time, don't become slack and weak. Be strong and channel your inherent will to power so that you can burn with the flame of Achilles or Ajax or any of the heroes that we read about in the Iliad. So those mythological heroes, Beowulf, everybody else, those are the archetypes that need to be driving you. You can be somebody who is as capable as them of shaping history and of carving your way into the world picture of human destiny. That, I think, that's the appeal of vitalism, and I think it has a lot of persuasive power to a lot of young guys. The idea that you have this within you, if you just choose to unleash the Achilles or the Agamemnon within you, you can be all of this.
So recently, I was uh, involved in a discussion with someone, a younger man, and he was talking about. He was contrasting. He said, I I really like a much more optimistic, strong, vibrant view of Christianity that says we're going to take ground, we're going to take, we're going to overcome, because said, I was raised with a view of Jesus only being meek and only being, just not asserting himself. And I can't stand that view. So as I was listening, though, I thought, I think, and I know I've emphasized definitions a lot, but a lot of our definitions, I think, are really skewed, because, I mean, and I'm not denying the need to live with vigor, but you think of somebody like John the Baptist, who comes out of the wilderness, eating locust and honey, wearing, animal skins, and he's, repent ye brood of vipers, because, the kingdom of heaven's coming, and he's going to burn you with it, and so on. And then he calls Jesus the Lamb of God who takes away the sin. This wonderful, not a paradox, but it is a contrast, though. I mean, Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, yes, but when he's seen in Revelation, he's seen with power and glory, but he's the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. So, I mean, so what? I'm trying to think of how to form this as a question, but what is how does Christianity how do vitalists try to wed themselves to Christianity? What is the correlation, and where does vitalism not overlap? Where does it push too far past the bounds of Christianity? That's a lot in that question, I know, but
Boy, that's a great question. Lots of people, I think, might take different perspectives than I would on this, but at least for me, the fundamental vitalist mistake is in recognizing that the strength of the martyrs is a very different kind of strength than the strength of Conan the Barbarian, and that being willing to suffer incredible things and bear up under horrible conditions for the sake of an ideal, that's very different than exerting your force in the world in a way that ultimately redounds to your own glory. And the glory of the Christian is it's pointed externally. It's not oriented towards themselves. And obviously we have hagiographies of the saints and the martyrs. We remember who they are, but that's not the essential goal. The essential goal is that the glory that they have is a reflected glory. It reflects their creator. It's not intrinsic to them in the way that I think the glory of the vitalist is. And the goal of the vitalist is to be somebody like Alexander the Great, who carves their mark on history. In the 2004 movie Troy, which a lot of people hated, but actually I quite enjoy, Achilles is offered the choice of, you can either go home and have many sons and daughters and be beloved, but you'll be forgotten in a few generations, or you can go to Troy and you will die there, but everyone in the rest of history will remember your name. And I think for the Christian, your name is remembered in the Lamb's Book of Life in the end. If your name is forgotten in the course of human history, that's an acceptable price to pay. And that there are many thousands of Christians who have lived sacrificial lives whose names are known but to God. And they're not carved in the pages of history in the way that the great conquerors of history might. And so to the extent that those two things come in tension, whether you're trusting in ultimately a transcendence beyond yourself, or you're living your life through the prism of the immanent with an A, I think that's the tension point. That sounds very abstract, but I think what it looks like in practice is that, at least as far as we talk about political action, there are going to be lines for the Christian that simply can't be crossed, even if that means that you'll be defeated or your way of life might take a hit. And those lines are not the same as would exist for the vitalist, who wouldn't care about, sacrificing however many people are necessary to achieve their own glory. But the Christian is called to ethical standards and God's moral norms that are transcendent, and that acknowledgement of a moral order that is not defined by the individual's power, but under which the individual stands. That's what made Judaism and Christianity so radical against the rest of the ancient world, is that they rejected that they placed human glory subordinate to a transcendent order. And to the extent that that's lost, I think the project we were talking about ceases to be a Christian one.
One of the things that you were just saying that's helpful for me is thinking that this is not a contrast of either strength or no strength.
Mm-hmm.
It's strength expressed in different directions. You can have strength when you are facing trials. That as Peter says, when you are persecuted for your faith, do not. First of all, I believe it's Peter who said, "Don't think it strange, considering this," but also receive it,
Right.
knowing that this is. I mean, Boniface. Everyone talks about the way that he cut down the oak of Thor. No one talks about the way he died at the hand of pagan thugs when he could have. I mean, those who were with Boniface said, should we fight? And he said no, because they were coming after him because of their faith. Now, I'm not saying that we never resist. That's not the point here, but it's just to say that strength is not only in raw power displayed by your conquest. So one of the online debates in recent times has been: should there be no enemies to the right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to have enemies? Like, in other words, should you ever punch to the right?
Mm-hmm.
Because people, we know we should punch to the left. That's easy. I mean, that's like swatting flies in a barn. But on the other hand, some say we shouldn't, because we need every person we can get who will be a co-belligerent with us in defeating the junk.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just one way that it seems like these two manifest themselves differently from what you said.
Right. And I would say that I utterly reject the no enemies to the right idea. And because to my mind, what that does is that presumes a baseline of left versus right that is more basic than the Christian commitment to love and serve God and neighbor in the various configurations of history in which we might find ourselves. And I've done my fair share of reading about the no enemies to the right thing. And the basic idea is that the left is everything that promotes egalitarianism after the Enlightenment. I'm probably paraphrasing, but that's basically the idea. And this, to my mind, misses the point that what Christianity brings in, uniquely again in human history, is the idea that yes, there are hierarchies in the world. There's a created order under which we stand, and human beings are subordinate to God's law. But there also is a radical equality that undoes traditional hierarchies, that undoes the idea that you are part of a city with its own local gods and a family with its own local gods, and you have a caste position that puts you over the plebeians or the slaves or whomever else you might have within your civilization. And so there are both hierarchical and egalitarian tendencies within the universal Christian message. The goal of the Christian cannot be for the right, defined as the principle of hierarchy, to defeat the left, defined as the principle of egalitarianism. That is disordered. The goal of the Christian is to promote God's created order and bring society into conformity with that if their vocation is a political vocation. And that at times means that Christians are going to be arguing for, if they're in the context of the Roman Empire, then they're going to be the forces of egalitarianism against the traditional hierarchies. If that's in contemporary America, that probably looks more like defending the law of God against the people that would say that doesn't exist. But as a working principle, I think for Christians, the line is not simply between left and right in this sense. It's a question of figuring out what God's relationship to both equality and hierarchy looks like, and working to bring society towards that ideal. And so I understand the people that want to organize aggressively and form a political coalition. I mean, my job is in politics as a day job, and so I understand the need to build political coalitions. But to make no enemies to the right a kind of operative moral principle that applies to how we do theology and public theology in the church, I think that's an incredibly risky path.
In addition, there's also, I've observed a hunger for many to escape materialism.
Mm-hmm.
There, people, I mean, we know inherently there is more to life than just flesh and blood. And there's more than just the Bible that presents a non material view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So the term reenchantment has become more prominent, you know, the seeds of which were laid down certainly by Charles Taylor in, in the secular age. But then it's gained, reenchantment has gained popularity with people like Rod Dreher and, and other thinkers as well. So again, it seems that both, going back to the discussion of pagan mythology and then pagan mythology and Christianity both offer an escape from materialism,
Mm-hmm.
but they are two different paths to reenchantment. Not all. I mean, it does. Not all reenchantment's a good thing.
Absolutely. And I think Stephen Smith has a wonderful book that he wrote on this called Pagans and Christians in the City. And this came out a few years ago. And he's a law professor who thinks about how these theological questions implicate our current legal debates. And he draws a distinction between two different types of sacredness or enchantment. With Christianity and with Judaism before that, and probably also with Islam, you have a concept of the sacred as ultimately other than the world, as transcending the world, and that such that everything in the world is ordered in relation to its transcendent source. All the powers and forces and spirits that might exist in the world, in Taylor's enchanted world, ultimately are in God's world and subordinate to God's created order. But then, on the other hand of things, you have an immanent sacred, again with an A, and that would be the idea that the process of becoming itself, the entire natural order in which we live and move and have our being here below, that is in fact charged with a kind of sacredness in and of itself. So it's looking at the same set of data that you'd see from a secular materialist, but it chooses to adopt a very different posture towards that and say that this order in which I find myself, this natural order, this is itself divine. The process of becoming and the process, all the natural forces and hierarchies and differences that we see around us, that is the sacred order to which I should conform and ordain my life. And this doesn't require any conflict between religion and science in the contemporary sense. It's basically just saying, I choose to interpret the data of reality in a way that treats it as fundamentally enchanted. And that's where you start seeing arguments about divinity and hierarchy and some people being superior to others in a natural way, but you see that charged with religious language. And an important book that really changed how I thought about this is Fustel de Coulon's book, The Ancient City, which is a study of how Greeks and Romans thought about their own religion and thought about their gods. And this is very difficult for a lot of us who have come of age in like the era of Disney Hercules to grasp. But the basic point is that the Greeks and Romans, when they talked about Ares, the god of war, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, they weren't thinking about spirits independent of the world who are coming and going within the world, off to Mount Olympus, popping down for a visit, even though some of their poetry, like the Iliad, does talk in those terms. On a metaphysical level, what they understood to be the role of the gods were what we typically call natural forces now. So if you see a thunderstorm rolling in, that's not sent by Zeus. That is Zeus coming to change the landscape. If you experience love, that's not Aphrodite sending love into your heart from some transcendent beyond. That is Aphrodite, and that is the arrows of Cupid working in you. And so this idea that the immanent or the experienced natural phenomenal world is in fact sacred, that's what enchantment looks like before Judaism and Christianity come in and say, no, all of this is the creative outpouring of a God who is beyond all this, who is beyond nature, and against whom all nature is ultimately relativized. So that's the kind of dark enchantment, I guess you could say, that the vitalist is tapping into. He's recognizing that there was a time in which these natural forces, rage and anger, we didn't think of that as just being chemical reactions in the brain. We thought about it as being a man who is channeling the spirit of Ares, the god of war, and somebody who could make the argument that instead of talking about this in these secular materialistic terms, we should go back to this much older and deeper dark enchantment of the world.
You point in one of your articles to St. Augustine as one who answers or who provides an answer to vitalism. So, how does that good doctor of the church help us understand and answer the vitalist call today?
So what Augustine really grasps well, and because he came out of this milieu, he understood it incredibly well. What he grasps is that the idea of the immanent divine, or the pagan enchantment of the world, it can't provide within itself any internal criteria that determine what is good or bad in any meaningful sense. It can't be meaningfully a path to some form of ethical order or way to live in the world, because it says that anything that is in some fashion divine, and the world contains both beauty and horror. He's got a great quote that says, "Who, unless he is quite mad, could bear the thought that parts of God can become lascivious, iniquitous, impious, and altogether damnable?" So if the divine is everything and everything is the divine, then how are you going to live in that world? What kind of ethical excellence can you point to? If you really carry this logic through consistently, then the person who's living on their couch in slovenly fashion, just playing video games and eating Doritos all day, that is an aspect or expression of the divine that in a truly consistent vitalist cosmology, you have no grounds for saying that's less divine than the man who is charged with the fire of pure being leading an army into war.
A few times you've quoted or you've referred to both the Jewish and the Christian tradition. But you also have an article on how within the Christian tradition there is a subset of Christian doctors in the faith who express what many would call anti-Semitic thought. Now, again, that's another very loaded term, and it's been weaponized by those on the left to refer to anything they don't like, essentially. So again, let's start with the definition. What is anti-Semitism, and is it really present in the Christian tradition?
So I think we can draw a distinction here, and I'm following some other scholars in doing this, between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And that anti-Judaism would be the idea that Christians are opposed to Jewish people because they see them as rejecting the Messiah and as causing problems in society that follow from that. And anti-Semitism would be where there's those long-standing patterns of anti-Judaism take on a biopolitical dimension and reflect the kind of ideas, the evolutionary ideas of race that come in starting in about the 16th and 1700s, and that people start to see the Jewish people as defined not just differently as a matter of religion, but also as defined fundamentally different as a matter of biology. And I think it's fair to say that the anti-Semitism aspect of the biopolitics, there are Christians who have made that argument, and that's something that we see in Hitler's Reich in particular. But then we do see anti-Judaism in the tradition prior to that, and I would disagree that both the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic paths, I think both of those reflect a failure to understand in a really deep sense the relation of what the Jewish testimony is relative to the Christian tradition. And so that's one of the articles that I've written recently, and the argument that I make there is that the core common denominator between Jewish and Christian understandings of God is this recognition that God is other than the world, that human beings have a final end other than being excellent in the reality and the created order in which we find ourselves, and that ultimately human beings are subject to moral standards that aren't just products of society or convention, but reflect that absolute transcendent moral order. And that's the deep continuity between the Jewish and Christian understandings of God that sets off the entire Jewish Christian Western tradition from everything that came before that. And I would say is starting to emerge after that fact. So there's a true uniqueness in the understanding of who God is that we see reflected there. And I think that in the context of the Middle Ages and in the disputes that arose, this ultimately dropped out of the picture for a lot of theologians who were dealing with the issues of their day and didn't really have a larger comparative perspective against which to see this deeper continuity. So I think to the extent that Luther and Calvin said some of these anti-Jewish things, I think they were wrong in doing so. And I think it's fine for us to say that that was wrong. Our ressourcement doesn't have to be ressourcement of every single thing that anybody in the past said. All our retrieval is going to be critical retrieval. And I would say it's appropriate in this particular context, especially because in the 20th century, we see where this line of argument ultimately ends up.
So if I could play the, just taking on the perspective of someone who's at least still who questions these things. I mean, in a certain light, if you look at world history and if you look at certain interpretations of world history, it appears that the Jews play an outsized perspective, especially when you consider their numbers in world history, and often in many instances it's negative. I mean, people point to the rot in Hollywood, and they say, this is there's a lot of Jewish people who are involved in filmmaking, for instance. So you can align everything and see it in this particular way. So, what is I mean, for those who view it skeptically in that way, is that, I mean, what is the alternative that's not just a pure egalitarian diatribe, shut up, bigot, and moving on? I mean, so how should one view the problems that we see, and then we know that there's some association with this people group? How should we look at that?
So I think what people are describing in that case is that the explanatory data for that is that Jewish people have historically just been incredibly successful across a variety of different fields, resulting from the fact that as a result of all the persecution that they faced as a discrete and insular minority, to use the legal jargon, they've had to develop internal educational networks. They've had to develop a set of survival skills under those conditions that have allowed them to thrive in a lot of different cultural contexts. And so, to the extent that we're talking about effective work habits, you're definitely going to get a lot of Jewish people who are at the high levels of just about any industry in which you find them. So it's not just Hollywood. There's lots of Jewish intellectuals who've shaped the conservative movement, for instance. It's just I think that what we're describing here is just effectively the fact that Jewish people are successful, and there's a lot of envy that follows from that. And so I didn't write this in my piece, but I thought about it since then. I'd like to flip this back on the people who are really outraged about that and suggest that, we can actually learn a lot from this example of people who have been persecuted and found themselves a minority under lots of hostile civilizational conditions, and who have managed to hand on traditions and an understanding of their faith in a whole variety of different cultural contexts that have been very impressive, including even the Holocaust. And they've made it out, and they've managed to continue and develop and defend that tradition under those circumstances. So if we as Christians look to the wider world and see ourselves as under threat in Western conditions, then we need to be learning from the Jewish example of how to survive and thrive under oppressive conditions, rather than simply getting mad about the fact that some other groups have made it out and been successful.
So, trying to combine what we talked about at the beginning, the vitalist concept, the pagan mythos, as well as having just discussed, Judaism and its effect, and the Jews' effect on history. So we see all that come together in the 1920s and 30s with the rise of fascism, especially in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I appreciated in your article, you do not deny that there is an internal logic to the Nazi perspective. So
Mm-hmm.
people of, I don't know for sure if my generation was the one of the last that just would read that. And perhaps it's because there were still a lot of Holocaust survivors alive when I was in high school. I mean, I can remember going and hearing some speak in college who were on campus, and so we see this, but now you talk about the fact that there's a lot in the Nazi view that made sense. Well, people earlier may not in the past could not understand that there's any sense, but they say just look at all these atrocities. But now, for whatever reason, people have begun to go back, and it's on a continuum between either just acknowledging the logic that's there all the way to we should really start, not the persecution, but we should really, they had some really good ideas. So, I mean, it appears the language, the rhetoric that you see, and you see some of it in Italy and even to a lesser degree, but some of it, Oswald Mosley, the British fascist leader that few talk about. You see this presentation of this ideal society, this vitalist society. So, what I mean, well, Christians naturally we see things breaking apart. We look back and we say, "Well, we wish it was like this," and then these people are saying, "Yeah, we've got your answer right here." So, what should prevent Christians from adopting that perspective? I mean, if we say, "Well, we believe that we can't go, all right, so eugenics is the line, so we won't go past there, but we can go up to that point because there's no explicit sin." I mean, what's to stop that type of thing?
My response to that is that as a Christian, you are not given the privilege of standing outside of history or without a history. And most the societies that we've previously talked about, the societies of where the theology is a theology of immanence or alternative pagan conceptions of enchantment, those societies had what Mircea Eliade, he's a scholar of religion at the University of Chicago, what he has described as a cyclical view of time and history. So basically, everything that is happening in society and the hierarchies and the order in which we find ourselves, that will continue just about indefinitely. That will continue throughout various time and throughout change and process, and everything that occurs will ultimately repeat. And the Hindu tradition has a philosophy of this, the progression through four ages, culminating in the Kali Yuga. People like to meme about this online, and that then things will ultimately be reborn and repeat themselves indefinitely. And I think there's a temptation for conservatives, and I say this because I am a conservative, to want things never to change, and to once you've established like an equilibrium or a way of life that is valuable to you and that is full of the things that you love and you want to pass on to your kids and your grandkids, you want that to continue indefinitely. But what happens with Christianity in particular is that we have human history being ordered from creation to eschaton, and that the age that we live in now is the age of the church, which is hurtling towards an end in time. That is a modern conception of history that we have that Christianity brings, and that Christianity displaces out of the cyclical view that we've previously mentioned. So history as such emerges with the resurrection of Christ and the eschaton in a way that ultimately has to reconfigure how we see everything else and how we understand what it means to be a conservative. And so if your goal is just for everything to continue indefinitely and you're willing to do just about anything to preserve that, up to eugenics, not including that, what you're doing is saying that we do not actually stand within the age of the church through which Christians work out problems and resolve doctrinal differences and think through the implications of Christianity this side of eternity. We're saying that the history in which we live in doesn't in fact exist. And I don't think that's something that we as Christians have the privilege of entertaining. That our ability to understand ourselves and our place in the world has to be ordered by the fact that we're heading towards union with Christ, and that we stand in a process of expectancy where the kingdom is here already, but also not yet. that undoes the kind of conservatism that wants history never to exist, that wants to avoid any sort of development or reflection or way of stabilizing a social order by whatever means necessary. We can't get that kind of stability here. We shouldn't expect that here. We have to expect that we're pilgrims not just because we're here below, but we're pilgrims because we stand in a historical process. And that's okay. That is what it means to live in history as Christians, and to live with our eyes fixed to a reference point that's beyond the cycle of becoming.
So, with that in mind, that takes us then, and we'll need to stop really soon. But one of perhaps my favorite article that you've written. That's hard to say because you've written quite a few that I like, but it's on Oswald Spengler, the German writer wrote The Decline of the West, and he speaks directly to what you were just talking about. He speaks to the question of what do we do with history, because his view of cultures, how they come, how they grow, and how they become a civilization and then decline, that has a lot to say. And you actually take a more positive view of Spengler that, again, I've not read many people outside of you who do, Christians especially, who have a positive view of him. So just without getting into too much detail, talk about him and what he has to say about the West and Christianity's role potentially in the West as it seems to come to its twilight.
Yeah, so Spengler's argument was that all civilizations, or all cultures before they become civilizations, have a life cycle. They emerge with a fundamental religious intuition or acknowledgement of, what I would say as a Christian, is acknowledgement of the reality of the one God who subsists before all worlds. And they understand that in a particular way. And that religious experience or way of understanding God in the terms of natural theology, that works itself out through the civilization's art, through its political forms, through its architecture, through its sense of expansion, through its mathematics. Spengler goes through this with about 6 or 7 different civil cultures as they emerge into becoming developed civilizations. But over time, what happens within those civilizations is that limited conception or perception of God and God's relation to the world, that the deficiencies in that begin to show up. And I'm to be clear for any Spengler scholars who are listening to this, I'm refracting him through a Christian lens. But essentially, as any particular civilization or culture is running on a clock, is running down, headed towards inevitable decline, and maybe not total destruction, but at least subsumption as new world pictures emerge and as new intuitions emerge that shape and drive civilizational order. And I think if you read Spengler as a classical theist, or as a Christian in particular, what you're going to see in there is the idea that Spengler does not deny the idea that history is ultimately working within an overarching transcendent frame, apart from which we couldn't even talk about epochs of history at all. That is the condition of the possibility of the cycles of history that he describes. And so if Christianity is true, and that entire historical continuum is in fact created and sustained by the providential work of God, then human affairs and the perspective of Christians, as no matter what civilization they find themselves in, has to be recognizing the fact that their cultural forms and their political configurations might in fact be transitory. That we've seen cultures and civilizations emerge and rise and fall as history has progressed. But that does not falsify the idea that there is a sovereign God who transcends all of this and who may be apprehended and acknowledged across different cultural contexts and across different world pictures that emerge throughout the course of time. And I find this very comforting, because even though I do believe that it's important to fight hard to preserve that which is good, and I think we have an obligation to love and serve our neighbor by doing just that in the political realm and elsewhere, that's important. That fight is not an existential fight in the sense of it being an existential fight for Christianity in the world. The Christian message is something that transcends civilizations and cultures. We see Christian cultures in Russia, in Ethiopia, around the world, acknowledging the one God that we worship here in the West. And so that's not saying that the fight day to day in America isn't important. It absolutely is. But it is a relative fight, relative to acknowledging that there's a moral order under which we stand that reflects a transcendent creator to whom we're ultimately oriented, and that nothing that happens in history can change that. We're ultimately promised that at the end of time, God will be all in all, and all of this, all tears will be wiped away. And I think that really has to norm our political engagement and the ways in which we talk about our place in civilization.
It's really hard for those of us who love what we have received
Mm-hmm.
through history. For those who, when we study history, when we think about the things that we appreciate, it's hard to say that our Western culture may very well dissipate the way that we know it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, North America will be here until the Lord moves otherwise. I mean, the continent will remain,
Uh-huh.
but the way that, but even just the land itself, its geographical features, will not outlast the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, so yeah, I'll say your article made me, who loves tradition and the West probably as much as any Protestant is allowed to. Um, it actually, for the first time, let sort of gave me permission to say, if this goes, that's okay,
Mm-hmm.
because the faith, once delivered to the saints, once for all delivered to the saints, will not go.
Exactly.
The church,
Exactly.
the church, there will always be the Word of God. The church, there will always be pastors or priests, deacons. There will always be the saints, and so, civilization. I mean, civilizations will die,
Mm-hmm.
and that doesn't mean that the kingdom of God declines. It just means that the kingdom of God manifested in this particular way will not be the dominant one. But at the same time, as we know with other civilizations, no, the remnants of that civilization don't all perish. The best is preserved.
Right. And people can pick that up and learn from that, and I think absolutely should. And I think that has to inform how we look at other cultures that aren't extant anymore or aren't live in this sense. You can take the best of this and work to steward that. And Cormac McCarthy, in his book The Road, he's got a wonderful metaphor that I love, which is the idea that it's about a father and his son traversing a desolate America in the wake of apocalypse, and the metaphor that they use for describing that they're carrying on humanity and decency is carrying the fire, and even in the midst of horrific conditions, even in the midst of total destruction, what they're preserving is an inheritance that human beings are more than beasts. And I think it's a helpful way to think about Christians here below as the world changes and progresses, and that our goal is not to do everything that we possibly can to shore up the Imperium, and but that's also not a counsel to be just be managers of decline, as if we could just stand back and let
Right,
the fire
right.
go out. There's a way to carry the fire through these conditions that doesn't absolutize either aspect of that, and I think that's the course that Christians need to be reflecting on.
Right. We don't bow to the cultural winds. We stand knowing, doing what Tolkien called, we fight the long defeat, which is actually, as Chesterton says in The Everlasting Man, is not a defeat, because Christianity's died multiple times and rose again, because we know we serve the God who knows the way out of the grave.
Right, definitely.
So, John, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking time with us again. John Ehrett, he's written for multiple online and print magazines, and so you can get a lot from his writing. So, thanks, John, for taking time with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
The Good Life podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, Got a Minute, featuring Larson Hicks and Rich Lusk. Theology, philosophy, economics, politics, and more for normal people.